Story 1. Some memories don't thin out with time. They just change shape until you don't trust the edges anymore. My name is Michael Reed. I'm 33, and in late autumn of 2017, I was a UI designer working freelance out of a one-bedroom in Logan Square, Chicago. I slept odd hours, kept odd habits. When a project ran late, I'd walk to clear the static, down Milwaukee where the blue line murmurs under everything, past the taco stands and the shuttered barber shops, under those sodium orange streetlights that make even clean concrete look stained. The wind smelled like wet leaves and bus exhaust. It felt honest out there at midnight. The bus shelter outside the pharmacy had a familiar vandalism to it. Stickers layered over stickers, a line of tags down the ad frame like a faded spine. I noticed the QR code because it wasn't random. It was one of those glossy black-on-white squares that shows up in side quests on r/ARG. Someone had sliced it neatly and stuck it in the corner of a perfume ad, angled like a wink. I scanned it without thinking, the way you tap a notification while you're still trying to wake up. The link was a simple text dump. No fancy front end, just an old-school monospace page with a string that looked like nonsense until my brain clicked. The spacing, the XOR, the repeated CTA. It had Visionaire written all over it. I'd lurked on r/ARG more than I played, but I knew the basics. The page suggested a key phrase that the comments were already guessing at. Elevated. I plugged it into a solver I keep bookmarked, watched letters fall into place, and suddenly I had 7 CTA stop numbers. That was cute. I mapped them on my phone, grinning at how somebody had spent a whole night running around the northwest side to make strangers smile. The stops made a shape, badly drawn at first, a dorky polygon I dismissed. But later, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling fan's slow orbit, I realized it was an arrow, not pointing downtown, not pointing at a landmark. The angle it made when you connected the last 2 stops lined up more or less with my apartment. I told myself it was coincidence. Everything interesting on the internet turns out to be a coincidence if you want it to be. The next day was a 20-hour sprint for a deadline, and I forgot about the arrow until I came home from a corner store run and felt something under my door. Not mail. Thinner. A paper transfer stub, the kind the CTA used to print with the timestamp across it in dot matrix letters. The time on it was 3:17 a.m. The date was that day. At 11:30 p.m., that future felt like an appointment I hadn't made. There's this humming anxiety that sets in when the air in your apartment goes from familiar to slightly wrong. Mine did that around midnight. I put on a hoodie, paced, tried to laugh at myself, then gave up and went outside. The sidewalk was glossed with a thin, damp sheen that made each streetlight double itself in small shivers. A bus turned the corner 2 blocks down and came up Milwaukee with that soft rubber squeal of tires, but something was off. The route display read 000, gray inside the LED dots like no one had told it what to be. It hissed at the curb like it was tired. Doors folded open with that sigh only transit knows. The interior lights stuttered in a broken rhythm, ballast failing, cold white flicker over empty seats. No driver. Or maybe one hunched just below the glass lip where you can't see. I waited for a second, the way you wait before stepping into an elevator that might be closing, and the intercom crackled. Static first, then a breath that felt too close, and I heard my Reddit handle. Not my name, my handle. Validate the last stop, the voice said, and the doors began to close on their own, slower than I've ever seen, like a stage curtain that wants you to make a choice. I didn't get on. The bus rolled away with an exhale. I watched the darkness inside like it watched back. By then my skin felt tight, and the breeze off Milwaukee cut through my hoodie like it had an opinion about me. Back upstairs, there were chalk marks on my doorframe I swear weren't there when I left. 2 neat vertical lines, white and narrow as fingernail moons. I wiped them off with my sleeve. The chalk dust stuck to my skin with that clinging school blackboard grit that tastes faintly like old limestone in the back of your mouth. I moved my hand away and turned on every light in the place, ridiculous, wasteful, not caring. I kept thinking about the transfer stub with 3:17 on it. The more I tried not to look at the clock, the more the minute hand dragged its feet toward that time like it had been greased. At 2:40, I DM'd a guy from a thread who'd been doing heavy lifting on the puzzle. We weren't friends, but we had swapped a few theories. I typed, "This thing is getting too personal. Did anyone else get real-world drops?" Before I sent it, the little bubble of typing appeared on his end. He wrote, "Validate the last stop. Haha, right? Except the message had a timestamp already attached. It said 3:17 a.m. By the time it was 3:10, I dressed like I was going out in a storm, scarf, gloves, a ridiculous wool hat, and went downstairs. The hallway smelled like bleach. The building manager had mopped earlier, and the tile held that chemical sweetness that sticks in your throat. The chalk was back on my door frame, except now there were 3 lines. I told myself neighbors' kids had gotten creative. I told myself a lot of things, and none of them sounded like me. The alley behind my building is a long rectangle between 2 brick backs, always slick with some small sheen. Fryer oil from a restaurant vent, ice from a leaky downspout, bags piled against dumpsters like tubers. At 3:15, I stood in that thin cold with my breath making little ghosts and waited. 3:16 ticked over. Somewhere close, a train wailed the dull horn that feels like it belongs to a different city. At 3:17, the air brake sounded. The exact chuffing sound of a bus drawing to a stop, and I felt it in my chest more than heard it. When I turned, there was no bus, just the darkness phasing around the shape of an absence, like heat around a grill. Then my eyes adjusted, and I saw it. The bus shelter advertisement from up the street, the perfume model looking over her shoulder like she knew a secret, glued in perfect glossy alignment to my own back door. It wasn't there an hour before. The QR code winked from the corner, as neat as if installed by a professional. My keys felt damp. The adhesive smell rolled off the vinyl, sweet, almost fruity, until I tasted it. I touched the corner of the ad because I had to, and my gloved finger came away clean, fresh. If I scanned that code here in this thin, cold hour of the morning, what would it resolve to? The phrase surfaced in my mind as if from somewhere else. Last stop. I didn't scan it. I went back upstairs, packed a bag, not all my things, just the things my hands found. Then sat down on the floor against the wall. The intercom in the hallway whispered again, a static exhale that might have been an old wire settling, or it might have been someone saying my handle very softly, the way you read it back when you want to make sure you have the right person. I moved within weeks. Told myself it was the lease. Told friends I needed more light. I left the ad on the door because the idea of peeling it made my stomach hurt. Months went by. My phone got a notification one night from a comment I'd made on the ARG thread. A new account had replied, "Did you ever figure out the chalk?" There was no avatar, just a gray thing that felt like a placeholder at a wake. I didn't answer. I made tea. In the steam, I thought about the last day in that apartment, the way I'd come back with the last box and turned to lock the back door, and paused, because the chalk marks weren't on the outside anymore. They were on the inside of the doorframe, 4 narrow lines that made my vision swim. I closed the door and walked away. I didn't look back, because I knew if I did, I'd have to count. I still check my doorframe every night, because it's easier to live with chalk than with whatever comes after the last stop. Story 2. If I hadn't lived it, I'd call it a story told too late. I'm Leah Park, 29 at the time, a barista in Ballard with a podcast that was more like a diary I let strangers eavesdrop on. January 2020 was all rain, the kind that makes you taste tin, and the cafe closed at 11. The ritual at the end of the night was muscle memory: mop the floor, purge the steam wand, dump the puck, lock the back door while the alley smelled like old coffee and wet cardboard. I recorded test clips in a closet I'd turned into a studio with moving blankets and a rug. Thin walls, good enough for the internet. I got into the ARG because of an AMA. The creator, whoever they were, had this playful, scholarly tone that made you feel safe to be curious. People from r/ARG swarmed the thread. Near the end, a comment appeared like a forgotten footnote, an HF frequency typed by hand, a wink emoji. Then, tonight, for the diligent. I borrowed an old shortwave radio from a neighbor who collects antique lawn chairs and stories he's never asked permission to tell. I told myself it was research for the podcast. Looking back, I think I was just lonely and wanted a voice that didn't know me. When the static slid into a regular rhythm, my shoulders loosened. Numbers stations are like waves, boring until they aren't. The voice came on a minute later. Female, British maybe, almost bored. She spoke digits. I had a notebook in my lap and a pen between my teeth, and I listened like a kid waiting for their name at the doctor's office. It wasn't my name exactly. It was worse. In the middle of a string, the voice said my childhood nickname, 2 syllables I hadn't posted anywhere, a pet name my mom used to use when she wanted me to feel small and safe. The room under the moving blankets felt lazy, warm with the radio heat, and suddenly I wanted to throw up. The numbers finished. I wrote them anyway. The set resolved to a timestamp, 00:11:36. The exact length of the audio I'd just recorded for a test, down to the second. I stayed up until the birds started complaining under the eaves. At 10, a padded envelope arrived with no return address. Inside, a little plastic crystal with a frequency band printed on it, the kind you slide onto the front panel of certain radios, and a dot matrix printout of my Discord handle, time-stamped 5 minutes in the future. I held it, glancing at the clock, at the analog muteness of everything. The future came and went, and nothing obvious happened, but my hands felt like I'd been wearing gloves in a warm room. That night, typing to my small Discord group, I caught myself narrating what I was doing. "I'm tuning now." The broadcast answered before I could hit send. The woman's voice said the sentence I'd typed, word for word, but with the radio's airy distance. I pressed my fingers to the desk until they hurt. A friend DM'd, "LOL lag," and I almost replied with a laugh emoji. But there's a difference between a glitch you can shrug at and something that lands squarely in your living room. The next puzzle round dropped the romance for logistics. Field validation at maritime coordinates. We plotted the numbers to the Ballard Locks pedestrian bridge, weirdly specific, and because I am a person who respects engines but doesn't like boats, I hesitated. I went anyway. It was raining, that soft Seattle rain we pretend isn't real. Couples walked by with their dogs in little jackets. I felt foolish, then angry, then determined. Under the rail, taped carefully out of sight, an index card waited like a note someone hoped the right person would find. On it, in blue pen, was a waveform, a jagged little mountain range that I recognized at once. It was me laughing. Not in general, not like any laugh. It was that specific ugly laugh I hate when I forget the mic's on and a joke slips out. The rise, the clipped peak. If you listen to yourself long enough, you recognize the way your body throws sound. That night I stared up at the attic window of the house across the alley because it glowed a soft orange that felt like tubes warming, not the colder LED hue of the neighbor's usual lamp. The glow blinked out when the broadcast began. The sound came through the headphones like wind at the mouth of a bottle. I took the crystal off the radio, thinking maybe I'd turn off the lighthouse and the ships would forget me. The radio still whispered in the room. I unplugged it. The whisper didn't care. I carried it into the kitchen and set it on the counter like it might walk away if I was gentle. I closed the closet door on the studio and stood in the dark, making my breath shallow because I was suddenly afraid to fog the air. The next AMA began after the cafe closed, which made no sense because it came through the ceiling speakers. 1 second it was the hum of the refrigerator case and the drip of the last rinse. The next it was the same woman, not bored anymore, voice intimate like someone at the counter leaning in so only you hear it. "Leah," she said, and I felt my knees loosen. "Leah, are you telling it straight this time?" Not into the mic, not on the record. That question lives in my mouth like a seed. "Are you telling it straight this time?" The sound skimmed the ceiling like a moth. My coworker, Austin, had already left. The door was locked. The open sign was off and dripping reflected neon into the sidewalk puddle. I stood under the little black speaker and looked up and could see nothing in it but dust. I went into the back room and unplugged the speaker amp because maybe it would make me feel like I had a lever to throw. The music cut with a petty pop. Then, in the silence that followed, the woman laughed, my exact waveform down to the clipped peak. I put my hand over my mouth because a stupid part of me felt like maybe that would stop it from happening again. Nothing overtly dangerous happened. That almost made it worse. No shadow crossed my window. No door opened. The world made space for what it wanted to do inside me and then closed back up like a muscle. I never put the crystal back into the radio. I should have thrown it away, but I kept it in a drawer like I was saving a lighter for a party I didn't want to attend. I stopped going to the locks. The Discord thinned out as big games launched, and people chased shinier mysteries in the months that followed. Every so often, someone would pop back in and post a memory like a souvenir, that time with the waveform, that half-solved code. It made me feel both less crazy and more alone. On a rainy Tuesday, at 2:14 in the morning, I woke up because the apartment felt like a stranger was standing in it. I keep my laptop and interface on a little shelf in the closet studio, powered off because the coil whine bugs me. The interface meters were dancing, bright green bars leaping, perfectly controlled, like they were listening to a voice I couldn't hear. 61 seconds went by. I counted because that's what you do when you can't move. The bars stopped. The room went back to the common dark that feels no more or less alive than it always does. It happens once a month now. Always a Tuesday. Always 2:14 a.m. Sometimes there's a little phantom smell of sea salt that I could blame on the damp. Sometimes there's the softest memory of steam in my nose, like espresso heat and warm dust that rides the back of old electronics. I don't record much anymore. When I do, I take the mic into the closet and pull the blankets close and I tell it as straight as I know how, even if that means going quiet for a long moment and letting the air between the words sit like a warning. I moved my mic into the closet, but some nights the room still tastes like rain and static. Story 3. Some buildings breathe if you listen long enough. They have lungs hidden in the risers and a pulse in the boiler pipes. I'm Rafael Morales, 41 maintenance tech over 3 walk-ups above a bodega in Mott Haven, Bronx. Late summer of 2019 was thick and slow. The nights held humidity like a grudge. My routine was steady: change air filters that no one remembers exist, check the boiler pressure even in August because old metal likes to be heard, sweep the back stairs of the grit that drifts in from the alley. I'd keep a tinny radio going on the window ledge, Yankees static through a cheap speaker, while the cat from 2B slept near the radiator that never really cools. The bodega's neon hummed under everything, a hot dust scent and a buzz that made quiet feel alive instead of empty. I wasn't looking for anything that night. I was carrying up a crate of stray UPS packages the driver had abandoned at the bodega when the payphone by the corner squawked a carrier tone. They still had the casing as a kind of street sculpture, no handset, graffiti wearing graffiti like old paint. Something pinged inside the coin return, metal on metal, a small bright sound. Curiosity is how you cut your hand on glass. It's also how you find keys. The brass piece in the return was heavy and old, stamped 305 in neat, shallow numbers. I turned it in my palm. It had that faint silt feel of metal that's been handled by too many damp fingers and then left forgotten. I posted about it, half joking, to a thread for an ARG I'd been lurking on, Hollow City, where people were chasing payphones, disposable cameras, hand-drawn maps photocopied until the lines blurred. Someone replied with a line I can still see even with my phone off. Return what was borrowed, leave what was found. Cute when you live elsewhere. Less cute when you work the building this might belong to. Our tenant list jumps from 303 to 307. The door between is a bricked-off rectangle with paint that doesn't quite match, like a scar no one talks about. There's a small dip in the floor where a threshold must have been. The superintendent before me told me the third floor used to be cut up differently, that city codes and a deal with a contractor during the 70s made things vanish on paper. He'd laugh, then cough. Places get rearranged, Rafa, he'd say. Don't go hunting the missing walls. The disposable camera turned up 3 days later in the bodega's bread rack between hot dog buns and a loaf of cheap white. The note taped to it said, in neat block letters, "Take only the hall." No faces. The plastic smelled like that specific sweet stink of fresh film and powdered gloves. I stood in the hall at midnight, with the fluorescent buzzing and the cat watching, and I lifted the camera, thumbed the advance wheel, and clicked. The flash popped against the paint, making a momentary second hallway on the insides of my eyelids. I took shots of the brick doorway from angles I'd never consider if I wasn't trying to be obedient to a stranger's instructions. Low to the floor to catch shadow, high to catch the lip of plaster, straight on to catch nothing but my own hesitation. I put the camera back in the bread rack because following rules felt like the only control I had. My hands smelled like cardboard and flour dust afterward. The pharmacy kiosk still does prints if you feed it and wait. When the photos came midnight blue and glossy into the tray, I flipped through, bored at first with how literal I'd been. Then the fifth frame pressed cold against my thumb. The bricked door was open. The photo quality was garbage. The automatic exposure chased black and found it. But the rectangle wasn't brick red anymore. It was a dark that suggested depth, and inside the dark a gray smear that felt like stairs going up where no stairs should be. I touched the print and felt that old childhood distrust of images that show you something you weren't present for. I took the stack and told myself there are a dozen ways to fake a moment. Most of them look a lot like forgetting. The next day, down in the basement, I opened the fuse panel to kill power to the stairwell light so I could swap a ballast. Taped neatly under the metal, centered like a label someone took pride in, was a Polaroid of me from behind, taken that morning as I checked the mailboxes. The angle was impossible unless you floated 3 feet inside the wall. The back of my neck in the photo looked older than I feel. The white border had a date printed along the bottom where someone had typed it on a ribbon. Next Tuesday. I carried the Polaroid up to my apartment and put it on the table like a guest I wasn't sure how to entertain. Hollow City threads surged with speculation about keys and hauls and returns. It felt good to be part of something, even if the edges made me want to dim the room. Tuesday came hot and slow. At 10, I did my rounds. At 11:30, I turned off the hallway lights. Everything softened to pool table green and stair glow. The air by the bricked space was a degree cooler and smelled chalky, the way old plaster does when it's been handled and sanded and handled again. I held the 305 key in my right hand and traced an imaginary lock where the seam in the paint hinted at a memory. The key's teeth raked nothing. Then a sound came from inside the wall, soft, intimate, like a cylinder turning in an old mortise. Not loud enough to be heard if there'd been a TV on in any apartment. Loud enough to make the hair on my wrist rise because it carried the private confidence of mechanics doing what they're meant to do. Above me, on the floor that doesn't exist, footsteps crossed left to right, slow, deliberate, with the whisper of weight over unfinished wood. They reached a point that corresponds to where 307's couch would be if there were a 305 to share the wall. Then they stopped. I waited long enough to taste metal in my mouth. The cat meowed once and then fell silent like a person who realized they were interrupting something serious. I didn't sleep that night. I put the key on my dresser and watched it until the shape lost meaning and turned back into a piece of brass I could pretend came from a flea market. A week later, the camera came back. Same bread rack, same note. I didn't touch it. Hollow City spun on without me. People posted maps and traced lines and told each other we were all in this together like kids challenging dares at a summer camp. I made small repairs. I swept the back stairs. I ignored the smell of faint damp in the bricked wall like it wanted me to test it with my palm. I decided to quit the ARG the way you decide to cut a habit. Plain, private, done. That night the key was gone from my dresser. I tore the apartment like I was late for a flight and it had my passport in its mouth. Nothing. I went downstairs, unlocked the supply closet because people do steal from a maintenance tech who leaves things out, and checked every shelf. No key. No satisfaction in discovering it missing. Just a small hole that made air whistle around other parts of my life. 2 months later, the city cooled. On the roof, changing a filter on a whiny exhaust fan, wind steady from the river, I put my hands in my jacket pocket and found warm metal like a coin held too long. The key lay there, patient. Next to it was a Polaroid I didn't feel myself take. The third-floor hallway, lights off, a smudge that could be a person, or the way a cheap lens record shadow, time-stamped 5 minutes from now. I looked over the parapet and saw my own hallway window, square and dumb in afternoon sun. I waited because I couldn't not. 5 minutes stretched their legs. Then something like movement happened behind the glass, like a thought passing over a face. It might have been the refrigerator cycling. It might have been a draft. It might have been a photograph deciding what it wanted to remember. The photo lives in a drawer with takeout menus and a coil of twine. Sometimes I think about throwing it out and then remember the trash is a hallway too. I got rid of the disposable camera the second time it appeared, dropped it into the deep mouth of the bottle return with a clatter that felt rude. That doesn't mean the photos stopped. Every few weeks a glossy print shows up under my door. Hallway shots from impossible angles, always at night. Always the bricked space in frame like a celebrity making sure you don't forget them. No faces. The lighting is too even to be natural. It has the softness of fixtures that haven't been updated since the 70s. People ask me sometimes why I didn't move, as if walls don't travel, as if a doorway that remembers you needs a fixed address. The photo stays in the drawer. The camera didn't. Someone else is still doing the shooting. Story 4. Deep winter changes what the world lets you hear. Snow eats engine noise and makes bells carry too far. My name is Carol Whitman. I was 56 that January of 2023, working hospice nights in rural Penobscot County, Maine. My hours ran from 3 to 4 in the morning like a narrow road between 2 dark woods. Routine kept me honest. Thermos of tea, heated seat ticking, the comforting discipline of a job where endings aren't failures, just the work. When I came home to the cul-de-sac, The thermometer would hide its 0 with a stubborn dash, and the sky felt closer than usual, like a held breath. I like puzzles because there's a kindness in a solution. Whiteout Signals was a small one that winter, an ARG where people decoded plow GPS logs and crossed them with NOAA timestamps to draw glyphs onto satellite maps. A friend from Bangor showed me the r/ARG thread, and I started playing after shifts, eyes grainy, tea going cold. The house settled around me with the tiny crack noises wood makes when it remembers temperature. I posted a fix for a segment that had everyone stumped. The final line of the glyph, neat when you traced it, passed right over my street if you scaled it just wrong. I shrugged at coincidence and went to bed with my socks on because I still haven't found a pair of slippers I like. The next clue dropped later that day. Mark the bell line, with a little wind chime emoji that felt more taunt than hint. On my mailbox that night was a strip of reflective tape, too narrow to be useful, shiny in a way that threw my headlights back with a disciplined little glare. Beneath it, a small jingle bell on red thread, the craft kind you tie to a cat's collar, barely audible in the wind. It tinkled once as I unlocked my door, and I almost laughed. It felt like the world trying to be cute in a month that rarely is. The plows did a perfect loop of the cul-de-sac after the storm. I watched them from the window, appreciating a clean edge the way you respect a skill. Then noticed the untouched arc right in front of my house, like someone had traced a bowl in the snow and told the city to skip it. When I pulled up the map and drew the line, that negative space completed the glyph we'd all been building. I told myself it was a trick of the plow pattern, that these things happen, that no one cares where Carol's driveway sits in the grand scheme of a game, but the bell on my mailbox swung in a wind I wasn't feeling. A note tucked under my wiper the following night was wet at the edges where snow had flirted with it and then given up. "Your turn to move," it read, block print careful enough to suggest gloves and a Sharpie. I stood with my shovel in the untouched arc and dragged the metal through the snow with a long scrape that sang in the cold air. The sound was too bright for the hour, and it reminded me of clinic tools in stainless pans. When I lifted the shovel, the line I'd cut narrowed as powder drifted in to hide it. Far down the road, another bell answered mine, barely there. It could have been someone's front porch decor. It could have been not that. I went out again at 2:30 with the thermos and a hat that makes me look like a lighthouse keeper in a children's book. The quiet stung. Headlights glanced through the bare trees and vanished, and I realized, belatedly, that I hadn't heard an engine. At 3:33 a.m., a plow rumbled down the cul-de-sac with no lights on, blade raised like a parade float rehearsing in the dark. It slid past my house. Snow peeled off in a neat ribbon, making the untouched arc complete again. I didn't see a driver. I couldn't tell you if there was glass in the cab. The air around it changed temperature, the way a refrigerator door changes the kitchen if you stand with it open too long. I stepped into the road and felt the kind of dizzy you get when you stand up too fast. The bell on my mailbox tinkled in a rhythm that made no acoustic sense for the wind we were having. Somewhere behind me, another bell answered a beat later. Then another, farther away, and another, closer. The pattern resolved into a count. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, that matched the timing marks we'd been decoding from the plow GPS the week prior. The bells kept time for a minute, then a minute more. I don't know how long exactly, because watching a clock felt like rudeness when something is keeping time for you. I cut the thread off the bell the next afternoon and dropped it in the junk drawer with spare oven knobs and a pencil sharpener that only works for one brand. The thread had a faint salt tang to it when I put it between my fingers, a sea smell that had no business 4 miles inland with the roads blocked the way they were. I told myself thread absorbs air from wherever it was made. I told myself a lot of things. I emailed the ARG group and wrote that the last segment was a head fake and we should abandon it. Polite arguments came back with links and arrows and little composite maps that made my street look like a point on a rune. First thaw has its own smell. Earth coming back, a little rot, the whisper of things waking not because they want to, but because the clock says so. At the edge of my yard, where the plows always nudged the dirty snow into small continents, 3 slim stakes appeared in a day, thin dowels driven into the softening ground, each wrapped with red thread in a neat barber pole of no-nonsense intent. A bell hung off each, small and mean. I bent down, and the thread smelled like a pier when the tide's on its way out. I cut it with a pocket knife, and the sound the bells made hitting the trash can was nothing, just cheap metal clucking against plastic. That should have been the end. 2 days later, a bell sat on my mailbox again. Not tied to it, through it. The red thread pierced the thin sheet metal like it had been sewn, a clean stitch snug through a hole that hadn't existed before. The bell swung against air that wasn't wind and clicked at a speed that matched my heart uncomfortably well. Threaded through the knot, a scrap of fabric I recognized, blue wool, frayed, torn from the scarf I'd lost last winter on a night when I thought the wind alone was talking to me. Work kept me honest. People whisper at the end of their days. They look at corners with respect. One woman took my hand and asked if her husband was in the next room. I told her the truth because that's what we're paid to do. She closed her eyes, listening, and said, "Do you hear that?" I didn't. Or maybe I did, and I had already learned to call it something that lives in the weather. Bells, far away, in a pattern people forgot how to write down. I stopped playing the game. Told the group the roads had iced over and my car needed a brake job, and I was stepping back. No one gets mad at a hospice nurse for missing a puzzle. The cul-de-sac still drew itself when it wanted to. Bells counted when they liked. I moved my thermos to a different hook so the handle wouldn't swing and make me flinch at the wrong music. Neighbors asked about the stakes when the snow receded. I told them kids. I told them weird kids. It made us laugh with our mouths and not with our lungs. I keep shears by the door now. Red thread is a domestic enough thing that cutting it feels like a chore and not a defense. This is the part where I say I moved. I didn't. The house fits me. The road knows my tires. The bell on the mailbox learned my name, but that doesn't mean it owns it. I learned to ignore the wind, but the bells still know my name.